evening, everybody. Umbiakendi, ne ohuahi o povi o hawe, ne kapo o winge o mu, na vitoa ke au mu. I'm going to speak tonight around a lot of starting with some of the reasons I got into this work around environmental health and reproductive justice. Moving back home to Santa Clara, Pueblo, and experiencing the impacts from hearing the open-air detonations happening on an almost daily basis at the time, which was back in 2008. These detonations were taking place at Los Alamos, which I would come to learn later were any bombs that were classified as too dangerous to transport for disposal. The way they dispose of them is by open-air detonation on top of our mesas. And if any of you here in New Mexico are aware of our spring times, our monsoon seasons, you know the winds we have here, how that soil deposition then carries into our entire watershed. And it was really an epiphany moment for me when I experienced hearing these detonations, and all these intersections were drawn in my mind of the social justice problems facing our communities around violence, addiction, poverty, could all be traced back to that original violences that have already been spoken of, but in this continued military occupation of our homelands and ancestral sites. You know, the militarization of the Southwest has been ongoing 500 plus years and now has turned into a form of nuclear colonialism, to where these issues are something, and as a way that intersects with not only like educational and economic, because future and current generations are not being educated on how to address the enormity of the environmental violence facing our communities today. We're having to educate ourselves on these issues. We're having to come together and share collective knowledge on how we're doing this. And I'm very fortunate and blessed to have been mentored by my very own ko'o from my community who have also been doing this work on anti-nuclear issues. One including Marian Naranjo, who gave the opening this morning, Kathy Sanchez, countless others who have been doing this work largely under the table because of some of the other patriarchal issues mentioned earlier. And I just want to be clear that I'm following in some very big moccasins that have come before me as far as the matriarchy who have been holding down this passing on of life-honoring knowledge, earth-honoring knowledge, and what needs to continue for us to sustain ourselves into the future. And there's very real efforts towards disconnecting of that traditional way of learning and knowing. And we know the harm that is happening on a daily basis, but yet the burden of proof still falls on our communities because of the environmental racism that we're living with and experiencing. And you'll see this anywhere across the country with any toxic site where these industries are going to be set up next to poor communities of color, next to Native communities, because they are then less likely to protest any kind of job creation that happens in these communities. So then it becomes used as a weaponized tool for economy and economics, to where our state is dependent on the war economy for any kind of ability to have a living wage for our peoples, and that's injustice. It's the ongoing racism of the scientific community, where adult white males continue to be the standard of reference for how much radiation exposure our peoples can be exposed to, how much workers can be exposed to, how much toxins can be released into the environment on a daily basis based on what is protective of the scientists in these places. When we know that women are twice as likely to get cancer from the same dose as a man, infants are 75% as likely. And yet, we also know that the first 15, 20 years of the laboratory's existence, it was completely unregulated by any kind of environmental protection. So all of this waste was being dumped into our canyons, being dumped into our sacred sites. Area G, the nuclear waste dump, some of our oldest kivas up there were filled with nuclear waste because how convenient, there's this hole in the ground to put waste in. And it continues to be just this monstrous issue that's up on our watershed that we don't know what to do with this nuclear waste dump. And just to note that we all live in a sole source aquifer on this land, which means that more than half the population depends on this aquifer for water, for wells and drinking and irrigation and farming. And so we can see how this pattern of militarization is spreading into our ability to be sovereign peoples. We need a clean environment to feed ourselves, to grow to continue with our traditional agriculture, which is the basis of so much of our ceremonial way of life and spiritual way of life. We are dependent on our seeds, being able to protect these things. Now they're welcoming in genetic engineering research facilities in these laboratories as well. There's already contamination in the aquifer. We've been dealing with community education around the hexavalent chromium plume, the perchlorate plume, the RDX plume that's already in our aquifer, that the state is only requiring them to clean up to the minimum standard, not protective of those most vulnerable, but to that adult white male standard, which is saying that we can all drink 50 parts per billion of hexavalent chromium in our water. That is not protective of indigenous pregnant people. That is not protective of children and elderly. So we can do better when it comes to these things. We can do better when it comes to transitioning out of this military war economy and in a way that is cleaning up the legacy waste of these sites, in a way that is decommissioning nuclear sites across the country, because we need nuclear abolition everywhere. In Japan, Fukushima Daiichi, they're in the process of decommissioning all their nuclear sites. It's going to take them over 100 years to do that alone, but they're doing it. And we had to learn a hard lesson at the loss of our Pacific Ocean because of that one nuclear accident that's releasing over 10 million gallons of radioactive tritiated water a day into the Pacific for 7 years now, I think. So this is in our backyard, in some of our oldest ancestral sites, that this production is ongoing. And we know that some of this toxicity is some of the only ones that can cross placental boundaries and impact future generations. So we know that from some of our teachings around birth knowledge, that in one pregnancy, 3 generations are held as one, because our children are born with all the reproductive capacity that they're gonna have for their entire life. And whatever exposure that pregnant parent is exposed to, that's then gonna impact 3 generations right off the bat. This is what is disregarded and not centered in our communities in regards to the environmental violence we're facing. And so how are we addressing this? We know that our natural systems hold the key for collaborative systems in our communities. We're using myco and bioremediation and restorative natural systems that can clean up these waste sites to 0 parts per billion. We need to all be advocating that that happens on a large scale. We need to be advocating that these budgets have the majority allocated to cleanup, because it's not the necessity of cleanup that drives cleanup at these sites, it's budget, not our people's health. So if they only designate 1-2% of their $1 billion budget every year to clean up, that's how much is gonna happen. So this is just a real general overview of a lot of these things. We know that return to our traditional foods is gonna make our bodies stronger in the face of these cumulative and multiple exposures to toxicity in our environment, because all of these regulatory agencies, the New Mexico Environment Department, they're permitting agencies. They're responsible for letting allowable levels of harm on our communities, not protecting our communities. And so we have to move to this way of industry having to prove they're going to do no harm before they're even allowed to open. So it's a real shift that needs to take place in this day and age.
5 minutes.
So if you want to learn more about these issues, there's a lot of groups doing really amazing work. You know, we're part of the Communities for Clean Water Coalition, along with HOPE, Las Mujeres Hablan. There's a lot of ways you can get involved in addressing this issue because it is a huge issue to address the military complex in this country. So I want to end with a poem about militarism. We all live in the shadow of militarism and a culture of violence, forceful occupation of ancestral homelands of First Nations here. We all live in the light of our truth, strengths, and stories of survival. Values of respect and care for our place still lives and breathes beneath this current of immorality that seeks to separate the peoples from their land, seeks to harm instead of help, technology twisted into perfecting weapons of war, water tortured into radioactivity before they are released into our living, breathing relations of home. Our life's vibrance held in liquid arteries above, beneath, within, weaving where roots take hold, they all join eventually. We are strong in our knowing that water is life.
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 Nuclear weapons production occupies our sacred Jemez Plateau, where Mother's heart beats fire as volcanoes sleep beneath. Layers of seismic fault zones, porous rock, watershed beginnings. Tewa existence threatened still from daily toxic releases, legacy waste, and the bloated war economy. Dene existence threatened still from fracking and uranium mining feeds hungry ghosts of war. New Mexico peoples in poverty fed a lie of economic gains from waste dumps, extraction, and feeding what is not of this place. We are fighting for the last % of our public lands not already leased to oil and gas, and nuclear waste will bleed bereavement for hundreds of generations in our precious spiral of seasons. And this is not a romance of violence from the past. It has never ended. It is what our grandparents endured as plutonium filtered into our skies of Pueblo life, where drumbeats could not keep the weight of airborne plutonium from falling into our beautiful earth in elder lungs. It was just 75 years ago that the United States government detonated the first atomic bomb on the people of New Mexico. Unwilling and unknowing of the death that rained down upon tens of thousands, they continued to drink this water touched by poison ash. No one told them it would mean entire families lost to cancer. No one told them they would not even get an apology or health care. And justice waits with them as they hold bake sales to pay for their medicine and funerals. It is continued harm to our unborn, our health and well-being, genetic level re-engineering of our seeds of hope. The same way our tribal leadership was forcefully restructured to make room for colonization, we must end this taking. We must resist this theft. Spirit is grounded here, and prayer is not enough to stop our uprooting of all we hold dear. We reject this war economy as a people of morals and ethics, standing up to a 500+ year regime of colonial tactics, to the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy war powers of cowardice. I speak this truth. You cannot erase whose land you walk. You cannot erase our existence. No matter how many swords of conquest are plunged into indigenous lands, you cannot erase the responsibility to care for us, this land, in respect and love. Life that flows through our memory will be here always, and we commit today and in the times ahead to hold this truth of shared responsibility to heal these wrongs. Tough, loving accountability comes from this anger of injustice. It comes from us uniting, smashing these walls of separation, and it is okay to admit that we are not all one until what is right is done. We exist in our own worldviews and in multiple perspectives, but we cannot continue on this path of planetary colonial demise. We know the largest devastation facing this earth is from military destruction, so we come together Here where prayers, sacred springs, and ceremony have sustained us since time immemorial, our issues no longer siloed and silenced. The harms all connect, and this movement is one that will end the myth they are not our problem, is one that will end the culture of toxic otherizing, working always to create a beloved community that restores what was taken, envisioning always this beloved homeland and who is included, where all of us are welcome to thrive, create, and share in what can be an abundant world, when the light of justice shines on us all equally, hope and action as we breathe life into our truth each day. Kadawa.